Welcome to week 5 on regulatory analysis. Regulatory analysis is a tool that agencies use to anticipate and evaluate the likely consequences of rules. It helps them organize the evidence on the good and bad effects of different alternatives that should be considered in developing regulations. The purpose is to determine if the benefits of an action are likely to justify the costs or to discover which alternative among several possibilities would be the most cost-effective. We're going to talk first about cost-benefit analysis, and then in Unit 2, we'll discuss how to incorporate scientific evidence into regulatory analysis. So cost-benefit analysis is based on Executive Order 12866, which specifically states that the costs imposed on business and government by agency regulations need to be justified by the regulatory benefits. Therefore, agencies must consider regulatory approaches that are less expensive. Those could include gentle nudges versus hard shoves. The Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House, has a circular called A4 that provides further guidance on regulatory analysis. It specifically defines what good regulatory analysis is, and it standardizes how benefits and costs of federal regulatory actions should be measured and reported. So cost-benefit analysis is relevant particularly where those costs and benefits can be quantified or monetized, meaning expressed in terms of money. In that situation, it provides a clear indication of what the most efficient alternative is. And here by efficient, we mean the alternative that creates the largest monetary benefits to society. But there are lots of situations where you can't really quantify or monetize costs and benefits. And in that situation, it's harder to really figure out what's the most efficient alternative. There, we do a threshold analysis. So again, a threshold analysis, which is also called a break-even analysis, is done if these non-quantifiable, non-monetary costs and benefits are likely to be important. That's when you want to evaluate the significance of those non-quantifiable costs and benefits by doing a threshold analysis. And what a threshold analysis tells you is how small the value of the non-quantified benefits would need to be, or how large the value of the non-quantified costs would need to be before the rule yields zero net benefits, i.e. before you break even. There are a few key elements to a regulatory analysis that you should know. First, it should include a statement of the need for the proposed action. So why do we need a regulation? 2, it needs to examine alternative approaches. You can't just focus on one regulation and one approach and assume that's the best way. The agency needs to see that different approaches or possible ways of dealing with an issue have been considered. And third, there needs to be an evaluation of the costs and benefits, both quantifiable, meaning you can express in numbers or money, and qualitative, which are not, so aspects of costs and benefits that you can't express in numbers, of the proposed action, and the main alternatives. So you have to evaluate the costs and benefits for both the proposed action and the main alternatives you're considering to that action. A cost-benefit analysis should do several things. It should explain how the actions required by the rule are linked to the expected benefits. For example, how would additional safety equipment reduce safety risks? And that also needs to be done for each alternative. In addition, it should identify a no-action baseline. So that means it should explain what the world would be like if the proposed rule was not adopted. And you would want to compare the costs and benefits of the action to this no action baseline. It's also helpful to compare a proposed rule to the next best alternative. And a cost-benefit evaluation should identify the good and bad side effects of the proposed regulatory action, as well as the alternatives. And those side effects need to be added to the direct benefits and costs. In demonstrating the need for the regulation, you should identify the specific authority for the regulatory action. And that could be the statute written by Congress or a judicial directive, so one from a court. That authority should explain how much discretion the agency has and identify the regulatory instruments the agency could use, so how the agency could go about doing this. In addition, demonstrating the need for a regulation involves explaining whether the action is intended to address a significant market failure, and we'll talk in a minute about what that means, or to meet some other compelling public need. And a compelling public need could include something like improving governmental processes, distributional fairness, or protection of privacy. And third, demonstrating the need for the regulation should address the likelihood of effective action. So the likelihood of doing more good than harm through this regulation. So as the middle bullet point notes, addressing a significant market failure may be part of explaining why action is needed. So you need to understand that there are several types of market failure. I don't expect you to really understand these in depth because this is not an economics course, but just to have a general sense of what some types of market failure are. So one is an externality, and that's when one party's actions impose uncompensated benefits or costs to another party. So for example, when smoke from a factory harms the health of local residents. Second is market power, which is when an entity reduces the output below what would be offered in a competitive industry in order to obtain higher prices. And generally, regulations that increase market power for certain entities are avoided or should be avoided. And third, inadequate or asymmetric information is a type of market failure. And that's when mistakes in information processing occur and markets may overreact. So regulations may be able to help correct that problem. An agency that also needs to think about whether regulation is, particularly federal regulation, is really the best way to solve the problem. So that involves considering what are the alternatives to federal regulation, including state or local regulation. There might be certain advantages of state or local regulation, which can include reflecting regional or local preferences and public values, serving as a testing ground for experimenting with alternative regulatory policies. And there are also disadvantages to state or local regulation. It may not be able to address interstate issues, and it could lead to fragmented policies or increased compliance costs for firms that have to meet different state or local standards. There's a presumption against certain types of regulation that impede market efficiency. That includes price controls in competitive markets, production or sales quotas in competitive markets, mandatory uniform quality standards for goods and services, if a potential problem can be addressed through voluntary standards or disclosures, controls on entry into employment or production, except where necessary to protect health and safety or to manage the use of common property. And there are also many alternative regulatory choices. So that could be different choices identified by the statute, different enforcement methods, different degrees of stringency, different requirements for different sized firms, different requirements for different geographical regions, performance standards versus design standards, market-oriented approaches rather than direct controls, and informational measures rather than regulation. This just gives you a sense of the different alternatives that agencies need to consider in choosing a particular course of regulatory action. The problem one of the problems that will be a discussion question topic this week is the implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. And so some of the questions there that you'll see is how the Department of Justice's analysis comports with what you've learned about cost-benefit analysis. So in the problem in the book that discusses the Prison Rape Elimination Act, you'll see Department of Justice's analysis, and you'll be able to compare that to what you've learned here about cost-benefit analysis. I ask you to identify any problems you see with DOJ's analysis. What would your critiques be of that analysis? And if you think DOJ standards will actually reduce the incidence of prison rape. So do you think it would be effective, and why or why not? Another question that you may want to address is what additional information you would want if you were going to reevaluate PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and its regulations under a cost-benefit approach. So that concludes Unit 1, and we'll turn next to Unit 2 on incorporating scientific evidence. Thank you.